My profession is long dead. I'm sure I'm not the last of my kind, but I'm certainly one of the only ones left who know enough about modern technology to tell you folks this story. That's my profession, you see. I'm a storyteller. I collect stories. I know, it sounds old-fashioned and cliché. The old man that travels from town to town, sitting people down and asking them to tell him a story. He writes it in his book and carries on. Maybe he'll publish it someday, become famous for it like the Brothers Grimm or Andrew Lang. No, that's not me. Oh sure, I sit people down with my big leather book and ask them to tell me a story, but I ask for much more in return. But we'll get to that later. How long have I been doing this? I'm sure I'm well into the triple digits by now. My first story was collected from a dying soldier. I found him on the side of a small dirt road deep in the country. I think I comforted him in a way. He didn't have to die alone. When was this? If I remember correctly, please forgive me for my confused memory. I've met thousands of people in my life. It was about 10 or 15 years after the Crusades. I never knew his name or how he came to bleed to death on that road. But you never forget your first story. His was a meandering yarn about a girl he once loved. Tragic. I moved around Europe for the next 550 years or so, averaging about 20 stories a year. My book never ran out of pages, my pen never went dry, and I never seemed to get any older. Sometime in the 1820s, I left for America. The stories there were very interesting, containing bits of local folklore and quite a few scary elements. Horror stories seemed to be the most popular kind of tales to share. I didn't see Europe again until the 1910s. Much had changed when I had left. People were less open, less friendly, didn't feel like sharing their stories as easily. Needed to get to know them first. My average dropped from 20 to about 15. In the 1960s, I returned to America, where things had changed even more. People were short, hostile with me. The art of polite conversation seemed to have died. Of the stories I did hear, some of them were stolen. I recognized quite a few as plots from old TV shows like The Twilight Zone or The Outer Limits. I didn't mind. If the story was unique, it ended up in my book. I've been here up until this writing. Before I go any further, let me tell you that I had at least full faith and credit in humanity before my latest encounter. Sure, my patience has waned, but I never thought we were inherently bad. Whenever a story was needed, I did what I had to do. I made sure my tellers never had an idea of what was going on. They were innocent after all. I was just trying to survive. I went to the West Coast, my first visit there since the mid-'80s. I made my way up, going from California to Oregon before ending up in Seattle one rainy night about last week. It was there that I met him. I wasn't planning to stay there for more than a few hours. Canada was a land rich in folklore, but I got thirsty. I walked into a dingy little bar to see a young man sitting alone at the counter, a half-empty pint in his hand. It had been about a month or so since my last story, so I thought, why not? I could feed off Canada's stories for years. We struck up a conversation about one thing or another. Half an hour or more than a few drinks later, he drunkenly told me he was a writer. That pleased me. I love my collected stories, but I always find it admirable when someone wants to put a story of their own into the world. I asked to hear a few of his. Before I get my stories, I like to make sure that my supplier isn't a one-note individual. Surprisingly, he had many interesting, unique stories to tell. I hadn't the faintest idea where he had gotten them. He mentioned a subreddit called No Sleep. I made a mental note to check out said website before I indulged him in a few stories of my own. He really enjoyed The Soldier's Tale of Lost Love, which I usually reserve for the first screening of stories. The next few really seemed to impress him. and I knew I had my next entry. I went in for the kill. Pulling out my book, his eyes grew wide. I told him of all the mystical tales confined within, how there were stories inside that predated historical records of his family. The thick, red leather made a satisfying thump against the wood of the bar. I suggested we go to a booth at the back of the bar, rather than look at it right out in the open. I was terrified that someone would steal my treasures and sell them to a publishing company for a quick buck. The man, already quite drunk, agreed. We went back and talked for a few more hours. I drank no more, but the man indulged in quite a few more glasses. It was now or never. Sliding the book across the table, I offered for him to write a story of his own. He could take my book for a week to mull it over before writing it and bringing it back to that very same bar the next Friday. I don't usually part with my book. I reserve the act of actually giving it out only to those that really impress me. Something the young man did. I felt I could trust him. He readily agreed. With a sad smile, I handed my most prized possession to him and left the bar, promising to return in a week. For a few days afterwards, I got heavy feelings in my stomach and began to regret what I had done. The more I thought about the man's words and his drunken state, I began to wonder if I had been fooled by the haze of alcohol he had been under. Who was to say he was that charming when sober? Eventually, I went to a public library and borrowed a computer. Looking up the 2 strange words he had said, I stumbled across this very site. Intrigued, I browsed the stories for quite a while before I came upon one that made my heart stop. It was the tale of the soldier's lost love, copied and pasted onto this site under another's name. Checking out the account, I saw that the writer had stolen countless other tales from my book, all the magic lost to the simple click of a button. And I vowed revenge. Walking around the city for the next few hours, I listened for the moans and grumbles that issued for the book, which only I could hear. After over half a day of searching, I descended onto the front lawn of a suburban house. It was late at night. The moon and stars shone in the sky. Walking up to the window, I peered inside. The book lay open on a desk next to a computer, pages fluttering ever so slightly. With one flick of my wrist, the book fell off the desk and landed with a loud thump on the floor. I wanted to test him. Give him one more chance. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Hiding in the shadows of the eaves, I watched through the glass as the young man made his way into the room, looking confused down at the book. His eyes seemed to glaze over, a slightly hungry look entering them. The red ink glowed scarlet in the moonlight. Scooping up the book, he sat down at his computer, flicked to a random page, and began typing away furiously. I waited until he pressed send. Let him think for one moment. He had gotten away with another one. The pages fluttered again, opening onto a set of blank sheets. The young man began to sway in his chair, a drunken, dreamy look on his face. His eyes rolled back into his head as his mouth stretched open. Pale, red light floated, like wisps of smoke, out of his throat. It hung in the air around the computer for a moment before diving into my book, new words glowing crimson almost immediately. He fell out of his chair and laid on the floor for a few moments, dazed. He began to convulse. Powerful tremors wrecked his body, but he seemed to be determined to do one last thing. Hoisting himself up in the chair, he began to type furiously again. At first, I was confused, but it slowly dawned on me. He wanted to leave one last remnant of himself in the world. I think he was almost done when he finally succumbed to it. He had been staring with horror at the new words in the book, recognition in his eyes. He went limp in the chair, one hand still laying lazily on top of the keyboard. The others inside the book howled and moaned at the new arrival. I usually try to be merciful whenever I need a new story. Not now. This young man had stolen from me. All at once, his body began to decay. His skin grew green and moldy, flaking off onto the chair below. The tendons and muscles and nerves turned black and rotted, landing in wet, heavy lumps on the floor. Blood and other fluids poured down the chair, staining the carpet. The soaked bones grew brittle and dry before crumbling into a dusty powder. I walked into the house and into the room, stepping over the remains and scooping up my book. The howling quieted, and I flicked to the new entry. A faint smile crossed my face. The young man had been a great storyteller after all. I looked up at what he had written. He hadn't finished. I had promised him a story, hadn't I? I added one last paragraph to his tale before pressing send. A requiem for a thief. As much as this medium entices me, nothing can compare to the pleasure I feel when I add a new story to my book. I wish I could stay longer, but there are still stories out there. I have ice-capped mountains to cross unfathomable oceans, to travel through deep valleys. All for the stories. I probably have hundreds that still need collecting. Thousands, millions even. When my pages finally run out, I will rest. But until then, when you see a person pass you in the street with an old red leather book tucked under one arm, think of the wonderful stories they have to tell.